Good afternoon, everybody. We're going to be starting the webinar in a few minutes. We're just seeing the well, in a minute or so. We're just seeing the numbers going up slightly, but we are going to get going very soon. Okay, we're going to make a start. I am mindful we have still got the odd person joining, but we'll only be discussing agenda and things like that. So we'll get moving, and we'll be sending out a recording if anybody does miss the first few bits anyway. So hello everybody, and welcome to today's Gas Assessment Engineering 9074 Endpoint Assessment Preparation webinar. Thanks for joining. So I'm Rob Ballinder, Technical Advisor for BSE. I'm joined by my Technical Advisor colleague David Pye, Janice Collins, EPA Partnership Manager, as well as the lead independent assessors for this standard, Neil Samuels and Steve Croucher. So we're presenting this webinar today from home, so please excuse any unwanted background noise or delay in the slides. To engage with the webinar, please type your questions in the questions tab or on the on-screen panel, and look out for links and updates in the chat and tab, because we are going to drop in links to a follow-up webinar to this and to surveys, etc. So we're looking at the presentation will take about 45 minutes, which will leave us time to answer most of your questions. If there is any burning questions after that, you have got our contact details on the slide. A couple of hours following the webinar, you'll also receive an email direct from GoToWebinar, which will give you the link to an attendance certificate and a recording of this session. You can also pass the link to this session to any potential people who want to register afterwards. They'll be able to access that. And we're also going to present a survey, which we will share in the chat tab at the end of the webinar. So let's have a look at the agenda on screen. So we're going to introduce ourselves just with a bit of an image. We have said who's on the webinar. We're going to hand over to the EPA Partnership Manager, who's going to have a look at the EPA process. Then we're going to look at what's in the endpoint assessment, the structure, the different pathways, the actual process, what happens when. And then we're going to go through basically the actual EPA. So we're going to look at the knowledge assessment, the competency test, and then we're going to look at EPA facilities and resources and how things are graded. What won't be covered today is some other parts of the EPA, which will be in webinar part 2. Too much content to cover in one. So we're going to put a link where we're going to talk about mainly, the work log, the discussion at the end of the webinar and the interview. That's going to be in part 2. So keep your eye out for that link coming in the chat. So we have said who's on today's call. You will have everybody's contact details on this slide. You can download the slides from the handout section on GoToWebinar if you wish as well. So now I'm going to hand over to my colleague Janice Collins, who's going to look at the apprenticeship journey supported by EPA Pro.
Thanks very much. If I could just take me on to the next slide, please. So first of all, I want to talk really through the timeframes for endpoint assessment and how we administer that on EPA Pro. So as soon as you've completed your registration document for the EPA application form on walled garden, you've got access to the standard within EPA Pro, and you can register a learner at any point on the learner's journey. However, we would recommend that you would do that as early as possible to gain access to the resource materials, and you can share those with the learners through EPA Pro 2. Once your learner has completed all the mandatory on-programme requirements of the standard, you can then submit the gateway documents on EPA Pro. And we will check those within 3 working days and check whether they're correct or incorrect. And we will notify you in the system or via email if they're incorrect, and then you can upload the correct information. We then have a planning meeting optional for you to have with the IEPA to discuss the standard and discuss the date that you would like the endpoint assessment to take place. So that is up to you whether you would want that to take place. If you're quite familiar with the standard and have had several learners go through that already, you may want to skip that process and go straight to booking into the calendar and booking the endpoint assessment dates through that system. The knowledge test you will still complete and book that currently through Walled Garden, allowing the 5-day requirement from booking the knowledge test to sit in the knowledge test. So once the endpoint assessment has been booked, the EPA Pro will update with the dates of that of the assessments, and for any of the elements which will be done through a GoToWebinar, then you would also receive the link, and the learner will receive the link through the system as well. So you just do need to make sure that the learner's details in the system are up to date, and that you make sure that in the notifications communication section in the top right hand corner of your EPA Pro account that you have your notifications set so that you actually receive those email notifications. Once the event has taken place, for each element, the results will be updated in EPA Pro within 7 working days, and after all components have taken place, the overall result will be out within 7 working days also. Your statement of results will be available immediately within the learner's profile section of EPA Pro, and we will also the following week request the ESFA certificate to the address you've stated in the system, and will issue a digital credential to the learner that they can share on their social media platforms. So quite a streamlined journey. If as a centre you've not used EPA Pro before, then please do reach out to me and we can provide some more detailed training for you. So I've just mentioned to you already that we do have this assessment booking section, which is fairly new and you may not have used it before. But it's quite simple to use. Once the learner is through the gateway, you'll get a notification, and the following day you're then able to go into your EPA Pro account and use the planning menu and click on assessment booking. You'll then select the component that you want to book, and then you'll slot that into the calendar on the date that you would want that to take place. For components like practical observations, you do need to give a minimum of 2 weeks notice from the date that you're actually booking the assessment to the date that is going to take place as an absolute minimum. But that means you can plan ahead with the employer, and obviously if you know the learner's going to want that in actually a month's time, then that's fine, you can book that in advance if you wish to, but you would still complete the evolved booking in Walled Garden currently, and they would still complete that in the same way. We do have the option now of remote invigilation as well for that evolved test. So if the learner is working away and you're not able to invigilate that test, it can be vigilated remotely by city and guilds, and you would book that service as well in Walled Garden. Another part of the system to show you in EPA Pro is actually where all the support materials are housed, because no longer do you need to use Walled Garden and our website or Smart Screen to get to those materials. As soon as you've put in your EPA application form on the system, you can then find the resources within the support material section. So it's down towards the bottom of the left-hand menu in the EPA Pro menu. Click on support materials, and then if you click on view and standards, it will list all your standards with all the actual elements for each of those standards together, which is a really useful place to access. And then the learners can also access the documents that are learner facing. So you'll see on the support materials on the screen, the very bottom one is tutor resources. So the learner wouldn't see those, but the other documents that are more learner facing. If the learner has a log on to the system, then they can also access the materials, and they can also have a read-only view of their results as well. So they can't upload any documentation, but they can review the result, and they can download their statement of results, so they can have that self-service section. But what I would just say again is, please reach out to me if EPA Pro is not something you've used before. We can obviously arrange some individualised training for you to take you through it. So the next steps really are to obviously register your learners on EPA Pro, so that it creates your booking in Walled Garden. So the learners, once registered on EPA Pro, will automatically be registered into Walled Garden. If your learners have been registered on another programme, just please make sure that you're using the same name. So for example, if you've used the learner's middle name in Walled Garden for their qualification, then please ensure that you use that in EPA Pro too, because there needs to be 100% data match to make sure they flow through easily. If not, there will be some human interaction to check that it's the same learner, because the last thing we want to do is merge two learners into one registration. Try and keep your gateway dates current. We do use that data, so we know dates do slip. We know learners don't all progress at the same time, even if you're in the same cohort. But it does just help us manage capacity, so that we know how many IEPs we need at any given time. And obviously, if the learners are not in the system, we're not aware of them, and we don't have those numbers to start that planning to make sure we've got the right requirements. So please, you can update that within the learners registration details. And make sure you're accessing the resources. They're there to support you from day one. So please, reach out to them, use them to help prepare the learners in the best way to have a successful endpoint assessment. There are 3 EPA partnership managers across the country. So please do reach out to either myself or my colleagues. If you're not sure about which one to reach out to, just reach out to me, and then I can get you in touch with the relevant EPA partnership manager for your area. And we're here to help not only with your gas engineering, but on any of the standards that we deliver at City and Guilds. But if you've got any questions, please do put them in the chat, and I'll answer them throughout, or we can answer them towards the end of the presentation.
Thanks a lot, Janice. That's perfect. Yeah, and I can't, state enough, those resources which Janice is referring to there in EPA Pro, they are structured around gas engineering. They're to prepare learners. There's sample tests, there's sample interviews, there's sample resources for a lot of the actual material in there. So please don't just sort of wash over those and miss those. There's some real useful information there for tutors and candidates. So now we're going to look at the sort of EPA and the EPA guidance documents. Just a very quick slide to let you know that obviously on the website there, you've got the Gas Engineer EPA Centre Pack. So in there, it tells you all about the resources you need. It tells you about how things should be structured for the day, how things should be set up. We're going to go through some of that today, but just to direct you to that document. And also on there, some recording forms, which has got a blank competency test form and a sample test for apprentices to use as a mock exam, as well as the EPA declaration form, which you have to upload as well. So please direct yourselves to the 907 Book 4 website, and just go under the EPA tab, and you'll find all those documents. I'm just going to direct you to a link to part 2, and a colleague of mine is kindly going to drop this in the chat so you can potentially register on this at the end of the webinar while she's still logged in. So you can pass on the link to other staff for this part 1. We can drop that in there as well. You get the recording though through to your inbox anyway. But we've got the next in the series, the part 2 one, as I mentioned, which is going to go through all the other parts to the the EPA. It was too much to drop in one webinar. So please register for part 2. Any staff who couldn't make it, please pass that link on as well. So now I'm going to hand over to one of our lead independent assessors for gas engineering, Steve Croucher, who's going to look at the EPA structure and process.
Good evening, everybody. So this is a little overview of the 9074 qualification leading into the EPA, because some of you must have already been through it or been through it. But if you're new to this, as my colleagues have said, if I skip over something and you want more detail or got questions, please drop it into the chat, or we have the question and answer session at the end. So the Sitting Guilds 9074 has 5 pathways, and all the pathways will lead to gas safe registration without the need to go away and do additional ACS qualifications. Each pathway will dictate what acts is required and what appliances have to be worked on at the EPA event. All candidates will be required to have a minimum of 4 categories, and there's an example of this on the slide there. But obviously the categories will change according to the pathway you're going. And then one of the requirements of the gateway is the candidate must achieve gas safe registration at the gateway. You can't get through the gateway without gas safe registration. And just a quick update on the gas safe registration, because I know there has been some problems. Can you just please check the photograph requirements before you upload it, because this has to go to gas safe, and my colleague Rob will may pick this up later. They are extremely fussy on the standard of the photograph. So it's not the Sitting Guilds, it's actually gas safe themselves that often reject the photographs. So on the slide, you can see these are the 5 pathways that you have the choice for your candidate, depending on obviously what they're doing with their employer out in the workplace. So by far the most popular route is pathway D. We have had some A's and some C's, but by far the most popular route is boilers and unvented. And if we can move on to the next slide, please. So Janice has already mentioned some of these processes, but you complete your 9074 and your maths and your work log and your gas safe registration, so you can get through to the gateway. Once you go past through gateway, and then we advise that you take your knowledge assessment prior to the EPA day, and I'll talk a bit more about that when we get onto the slide that deals with the knowledge assessment. And then you'll be booking for your competency test for the EPA day. Some of the things you need to do really before the competency test is that the task B of the EPA, which we're going to mention, needs to be complete before the actual day, because the independent endpoint assessor will collect that on the day and they will take that with them and mark that. And also their work log has to be uploaded before the EPA day, at least 2 weeks before the EPA day. That gives the chance for the endpoint assessor to have a look through the work log. If there's missing information, he can report that back, or she can report that back. That gives you a chance to alter that before the EPA day. And also the endpoint assessor will base his discussion or professional interview on the candidate's work log. So it's imperative that we do have that up and in the EPA Pro, so that the endpoint assessor can do the work required on that. And then after that, the endpoint assessor will upload their results. That will then be checked by either myself or my colleague Neil, who will be coming on a bit later. Then once we're happy, that get passed off to the results and certification stage. We can move on to the next one, Rob. Okay, so the evidence you're required to get through Gateway, you need your endpoint assessment declaration form, your gas safety registration, including the 4 elements, your program certificate, and your maths and English. So it's essential you don't try and book your EPA before you have got through the gateway. Next slide, Rob. Okay, so getting to the actual endpoint assessment structure, it's actually split in 2 parts. So we have the knowledge test, which most centres will know as the Evolve test. And as I said before, this ideally needs to be completed prior to the EPA day. The reason for this is that when the endpoint assessor comes, they will ask for the results of the Evolve test, and they will require the percentage of the test, because that forms part of their marking, which is what we're be talking about just a little bit later. And then part 2 is the work log or portfolio and the actual competency test itself. And that's broken up. So we have a gas safe registration, which they get marks for, the competency test, which we're going to talk about, the work log, which is reviewed before the EPA day, and then the actual interview, which is completed on the EPA day. So we're going to move to the Evolve exam now. So I know there will be lots of questions about the knowledge assessment, the Evolve exam. So there's 40 questions and it is closed book. So I can tell you that colleagues have took this back to the employers group, but it is going to remain closed book. The exam is for 1 hour duration. And as I say, should be complete before the EPA day. My colleagues already informed you book it on walled garden as normal, sat in the centre, and the usual examination invigilation is required. 79% and less, that's a fail, 80 plus is a pass, and 90 and above is a distinctions. And as I say, the endpoint assessor will ask for the results and grade on the day and collect that evidence, and that takes part of the marks. What I will tell you about the knowledge test is we know there has been some concerns raised about the actual test, and I can tell you that it has been looked at and reviewed, and it's been adjusted, and Rob will correct it, but the new one will be coming out live soon. So we have taken on board all the comments from centres, and the knowledge test has been reviewed for centres. So some key areas you need to know is the knowledge exam can be found in the pack that's available to you, and it will give you a breakdown of the questions and the number of marks that's going to be allocated to that question and the percentage that forms of the exam. So it's a very, very good idea to have a look at this, because it can also help the students and candidates revise, so they know what's coming, they know what's going to be expected of them, and it can help you target revision as well, and it also tells you what to expect when the candidates are going to take their exam. We can have the next slide, please, Rob. Some common question. We're often asked, why is the Sitting Guild set it as it is? Well, the knowledge comes from the employers group. They set the specification, so it's nothing to do with the Sitting Guilds. We just have to comply with what the employers group has instructed all the awarding bodies to comply with. Why should the EPA exam have to be completed prior to the competency test? If it's not completed prior to the competency test, the EPA day, and then the candidate goes on to fail the knowledge test, that will just delay your results. So it's far better to get the knowledge exam completed and dusted and out of the way, and then you know that your results will be sped up, because otherwise you will just sit on the system waiting for the candidate to pass the knowledge test before anything else can move forward. The endpoint assessor cannot attribute a final grade until they have the knowledge test results. So everything will just sit on the system until the candidate achieves that result. A lot of questions come up about why we're doing LPG in the exam. Again, that goes back to the employer group. It's part of the specification. It has to be included. It's not something that we are allowed to drop. The control questions are generic on CNCN 1. So unfortunately, again, that's something we can't drop because it's part of the Common Core. So an update, and again, I think Rob will jump in if I get this wrong. Up until recently, you were allowed to sit the exam once, then you had to have retraining, and then you could retake the exam again. And then after that, if you failed, virtually that was it, you'd have to re-register. But I think coming on board now is that is going to be lifted, and you will be able to do further retakes. How many, I'm not sure. Perhaps Rob may be able to pick that up a little bit
Yeah,
later.
thanks, Steve. We're sorting that out in EPA Pro at the moment. Basically, we've had to contest that with the EQA body, which is open awards for this standard, because it said in the assessment plan that only one resit could take place. Obviously, that's pretty ludicrous to say, you know, a candidate after one resit had got to walk away from the industry. So we've now had that cleared, that a period of further training will have to be carried out before any continuous resits. So, you know, they'd have to have an action plan set of the bits and bobs they got wrong and they needed to work on those, come back, and then we can now allow another resit to take place. What we've got to do now is just make sure we put that in the right format in EPA Pro, so we make sure that period of further learning is enforced, and we just got to work out how that looks like. But so there should be a change in that pretty soon, Steve.
Thanks a lot, Rob. So we go on to the next slide. Okay, so what we've done is there's quite a few things that come up quite regularly that candidates answer incorrectly. So what we've done is just done a little list here so you can have a look of where they go wrong. So one of the key ones in electrical awareness is safe isolation and essential safety checks. Candidates are not really understanding what's required and what they should be doing. Flue designs and different types of flues for different appliances, room sealed, open flue, that sort of thing. Mandatory safety checks, what is required when they're checking something out. Awareness of green technology, so solar hot water, solar PV, heat pumps, that sort of thing. It's catching some candidates out. Properties of liquid petroleum gas, calorific values, density, etc. And one that seems to catch a lot of candidates out is storage criteria for LPG gas bottles, distance from openings, etc., etc. And safety controls catches a lot of students out as well, or candidates out as well. So these are the sort of areas, and again, that's in that manual, in that guide pack that you can have a look at and read through. So that's my little bit done. I'm now going to introduce you to my colleague Neil, who's going to take you through the next stage. Over to you, Neil.
Thanks, Steve. So following on from the knowledge assessment, which was part one of the EPA, part two is what's known as the portfolio. So there are three parts to the portfolio, and it's worth 100 marks or 100%. The gas safe registration is worth 10 marks. The competency test, the practical assessment that they perform on the day, is worth 20. And then the work log review is worth 70. And as you can see, out of that 70, the work log scrutiny, this is where the assessor will review the work log prior to coming in, that's worth 40, and the interview on the day is worth 30. So you can see the work log is the predominant player here when we talk about the marks. So we're going to cover that next week in the next webinar. And then down the bottom there, it tells you the percentages and what is a passing distinction. And just a reminder, there's no merit in the gas engineering EPA. So that's how it's all made up, the marks and the structure. So the gas safe was worth 10 marks. As Steve said earlier, they need to have achieved the four elements, which, as an example there, CCM1, CEMWAT, CPA1 and MET1. That would be for something like pathway D. Obviously, other pathways will attract different appliances. You can have more than four, but 4 is a minimum. And in Gateway, what they'll need to, yourself or a member of staff will need to do is upload some kind of proof of gas safe registration. So that would normally be some kind of a photograph of the apprentice's gas safe card or a screenshot of doing a search on the gas safe website. If you can't do that, then please do make sure you upload the apprentice's gas safe number, and then we'll check it out on the gas safe website. So you get 10 marks for that, which you should have anyway, because you couldn't have got through Gateway without it. So that's your gas safe part. And then the competency test part, the competency test, the practical part, if you like, is split up into 4 areas. Task A is a landlord's gas safety inspection they'll perform in the facility in your centre on live gas appliances. Task B, now this is basically a paperwork exercise that they'll do pre the EPA day, and this is the blank forms that Rob mentioned at the start that you can find in your alongside your centre pack on the website. So these are forms that they fill in prior to us coming in. Task C is installation and commissioning of a gas appliance. Task D is servicing an appliance. And as we mentioned earlier on, that could be a cooker, it could be a fire or a boiler, but if they're on pathway D, it will be an unvented cylinder installation. And that will have to be a live installation. Okay. And next slide, please, Rob. So the competency test, task A, C, and D, is observed by the independent endpoint assessor on the EPA day. As I said earlier, task B is completed prior to the day. We do a maximum of 1 to 4 apprentices, although strong recommendation from us is if it's your centre's very first gas EPA, we would recommend you keep the numbers low for the first 1 or 2 EPAs, because ourselves and you will probably learn a lot from the very first 1 or 2 EPAs. Each apprentice will have to have access to an EPA bay for the day. You can't squeeze 2, 3 or 4 into a bay on the same day. So they need a bay for the day. If they're very good and they finish a little bit early, that's fine, but they need access to that for the day. We'll give them a briefing in the morning for about a quarter of an hour prior to the start and have a chat with them. We'll supply all the written instructions and the forms. We recommend it starts at 8:30, and we recommend to our assessors they get there for 8. So basically the competency test attracts 20 marks. So obviously we'll mark various aspects of the competency test through the day, and then we'll have a mark at the end of the day. Okay, Rob. You can find more information about this in the centre pack. It's on page 18, the centre pack, about tasks A, B, C and D. And you'll also got in there quite a lot of information to help you and the apprentice complete task B forms before the IEPA turns up. Yes, Rob, please. So task A, a bit more detail. The apprentice performs a landlord's gas safety inspection in the EPA bay. All the appliances must be live. All the gas must be live, as well as the water system for a boiler. The appliance types will depend on the apprentice's pathway, but remember, if they are performing what is essentially a landlord's gas safety inspection, they're down to do a risk assessment on all gas appliances. It might mean that if they've got a gas appliance, such as, let's say, a fire that they've not got on their ticket, we'll just expect them to do some very basic safety checks on that fire. Okay. Each candidate also has to complete a warning advice notice form. We'll show them 4 photographs from a selection of 40 gas installations. They will have to basically say what is faulty in the photograph and categorise them as ID or AR. They can use unsafe situations procedure booklet to do that. It's an open book, should we say, assessment. Okay, Rob? So as I said, task B, you have this information in your centre pack beforehand. You give this information to the candidate, and it basically asks them to produce a risk assessment about hazards that are going to be faced by employees on a scenario installation. They also have to list a work schedule. They're given the schedule, but it's in the incorrect order. So they just have to rearrange the order of the activities into the correct order. And then the third activity is to recommend an alternative boiler for the customer and provide the energy efficiency advice for the customer to go along with that boiler. So why have you chosen that boiler? What makes it efficient? And you might want to also maybe list some controls and system upgrades that will make the system more efficient for the customer. So this needs to be done in like a bullet point style fashion. It doesn't need to be a whole story necessarily. So once again, this is in the pack, the centre pack that you can download the instructions, and then there's a centre recording forms pack where the candidate can complete all this information. So when we get there on the day, we'll mark these forms that are completed, and they'll form part of the competency test. So there's the blank forms that the candidate completes. Okay, Rob? So then the candidate's then going to install and commission an appliance. This will be dictated by their pathway. They'll connect the last maybe 350 ml of gas supply pipework to the appliance using copper pipe and compression fittings, and then they'll also make the final electrical connection to the appliance. They'll then test and commission that appliance and record all the results on a checklist supplied by us, and then they'll hand over that appliance to the assessor. So what they'll have to do is, let's imagine it's a boiler. They will basically then say, you're a customer, and they'll hand over the boiler as if I am the customer. They'll talk us through it, how it works, how to top it up, how to alter the temperature, and so on. They must have access to all the appliance manufacturer instructions for that. Then task D, service and maintenance of an appliance. Again, they will have a maintenance checklist given to them. They will perform this routine service or maintenance check on the appliance. As I said earlier on, if it's pathway D, then it's an unvented cylinder. It must be fully operational again and live. The apprentice, if there's any faults or any remedial work required, they'll have to state that on their checklist. And again, they may be asked some oral questions while they're performing this task. So this EPA competency test requires a number of facilities and resources. There's a list of resources here on this slide, which I'm not going to talk through, but I refer you back to as it used as a bit of a checklist for you. So a centre might use this list to say, yeah, we got that, we'll need that, we'll need that. On the day, the IEPA would need some things like a Wi-Fi connection or a password for the local Wi-Fi. And they will need to have the area where the EPA is taking place will need to be off limits from other candidates and staff. So, right, next slide, Rob, please. This diagram and the listing and advice is taken from the centre pack. So you can see that it requires an installation of a meter and various appliances. Each candidate will have to have their own bay. It would help, obviously, if you have more than one bay, because then we can put different candidates into different bays for their install to what they were for their gas inspection. So if you've got more than one bay, that's fine. If you've only got the one bay, then what I would suggest is you might be a good idea to either have an additional appliance in that bay to help put the candidate into a different appliance for their install, or maybe an additional appliance somewhere just next to that bay. So what I'm trying to say is, if they've only got one bay, once they perform the landlord's gas safety inspection, they'll still need another appliance to do their installation work on. So an alternative appliance. So that's something to consider if you're planning your bays or you're building them. There's some examples here of some good practice from various centres around the country. So the ones on the left-hand side, they took the idea of having two boilers in the bay because most of their candidates were on pathway D. One was a combi for the landlords and the other one's just a conventional system boiler for the install. So that's something you might want to consider if you've got many candidates on pathway D of having two boilers, or maybe two cookers might be as a good option if you've got them on other ones like C. Some notes there. If you haven't yet and you've got an EPA facility, please submit some photographs or videos of the EPA facility to David or Rob, and they might send them to us for approval. So as we mentioned earlier on, the candidate's going to perform the last electrical connection and the last gas supply pipework connection. So what they have to do is connect 350 ml of copper pipe with some compression fittings. So they will need to have a pipe that's capped, that they then, once they've tested, disconnect and then connect up. As you can see on the example on the right, I've included this one because it shows the boiler already connected with a piece of pipe, and then the candidate makes the connection to that pipe, which might be easier for you to stop wear and tear on the boiler connections. Again, something like a fuse spur, or as you see in the photograph, maybe an extra surplus connection from the fuse spur to stop the candidate damaging the fuse spur. That would be fine. Don't forget, all candidates are expected to perform a safe isolation on the appliance, as well as all their commissioning on their gas side. Thanks, Rob. Again, a list of tools and materials that's required. I will make this point, and Steve will reiterate this. We do go to centres and unfortunately have to waste a lot of time running around, going back and forward to workshops, looking for tools, LDF, jointing materials, paste, pipe and so on. In one centre, I had to leave the EPA place that I was monitoring another assessor 5 times to get materials. So please use something like this checklist to ensure that the candidate has all the materials and the resources that they require on the day. Next slide. So frequently asked questions. All the frequently asked questions that we put into these slideshows are real questions that myself and Steve have been asked. So why are we making them bend pipe? Well, it's a skills requirement. I don't think it should be a problem for someone who's been on a gas engineering apprenticeship for a few years to bend some copper pipe. If they're on pathway D, why do they have to check a fire and a cooker? As I mentioned earlier on, there's a requirement for all gas engineers to carry out a risk assessment on any appliance or gas system within a property. So the IEPA will only ask them to perform tasks and skills on that appliance that is relevant to the core or CCM1 skills and knowledge. They won't be asking them to do skills or knowledge that would normally on an appliance that they haven't got on their ticket. Do they actually have to perform a safe isolation? Yes, with voltage indicators and a proving unit. So they will need access to that on the day. Can we have additional appliances within the bay? Yes, you can. I've been to many centres where they've got lots of different appliances in the area. That's not a problem. How many resits are permitted? Well, as it says there, 1 resit, and if they fail again, it's recommended the apprentice has significant retraining before a retake. So they're just some of the questions. I'm now going to hand you over to my colleague Steve, and he's going to take you through the results, the grading and the FAL system. Okay, thank you.
Can you hear me now? Yeah, that's it. I will just, before I start on the results and grading, just reinforce what my colleague Neil has said about the resources. So common faults is what Neil's already talked about, but also problems with analyzers. So printers not working, or the analyzer's out of its service date and won't start up. So if you could get your technician or assessor, whoever's responsible for that, just to check them out before the day, so they know that all the printers are working, that all the analyzers boot up as they should do, and that the candidates can use them, because there's nothing more stressful for a candidate than when they go to do their analysis and they can't get the analyzer working and they've got an endpoint assessor sort of hobbling around watching. So it can be a bit off-putting for the apprentices on the day. So if you could just check them out. It's so easy to forget with everything else that's going on within a college, and somebody overlooks that, and then on the day they won't start. So going to the results and grading, so you can see on the screen now how it's all listed out. So Neil's already mentioned, and I mentioned before, that you get 10 marks for your gas safe registrations. So that's 10 out of 10 before you start. The competency test, the IEPA will mark on the day and give a mark out of 20. And then the work log. So the work log, where it says work log review, is a total of 70 marks. So that's 40 for the actual work log, and then 30 for the interview that takes on the day, and you'll get a percentage out of 100. So obviously, you people there checking the candidate's work log, you can see if they've got a really good work log, they've got a high score going into the EPA before they start. And that can be a bit of a confidence booster if they produced a really good work log. So once we get the total marks for the portfolio, the corresponding percentages are listed there. So 69 and less is a fail, 70, 84 is a pass, and 85 to 100 is a distinction. And as Neil mentioned, there is no merit grade. You will see points listed there. So I can tell you that none of the endpoint assessors will use the points, they will use percentages. And they will take the percentage of your knowledge assessment, which is why I said, could you make sure if it's done prior to the EPA day, and then make sure that the percentage results of the evolved test is available for the IEPA. they will write that down, and that will be added to the marks to get them an overall result for the EPA. As it says on the slide, the result will not be disclosed on the day by the independent endpoint assessor, mainly because they won't have the total marks. They will need to go back if they're staying in a hotel and mark it then, or when they get home, they will put all the marks together, and then they have to send it and upload it into the system, and then a leaper such as Neil or myself will then go through and double check the marks and the grading and approve or send it back if we have questions on it. And then once that's done, then the grade will be uploaded on the system. So whatever happens, your results should be available within the 7 working days for you, unless, of course, as we say, the candidate has failed the endpoint assessment, and then the IEPA and the LEPA will have to wait for that grade to come in. So if we go on to the next slide, Rob. If unfortunately a candidate does fail an endpoint assessment, that will result in a overall fail grade for the day. However, they just have to reset the individual component that they failed. So for instance, if they've done a brilliant practical and passed that and then gone down on the interview, they would just have to redo the interview, or vice versa, or whatever way it's sort of gone wrong on the day. But what you will get, the endpoint assessor will complete a very detailed feedback form for you, which will be made available to you on the system that you can download and chat to your candidates with them, just to talk them through what went wrong and what they need to do to improve. But what I will say is that all the IEPAs, they will do their best to make all the candidates comfortable and put them at ease. As Neil said, they will have a chat to them beforehand to settle them down, and then obviously the IEPA will be with them all day, so hopefully that will settle them down. And I think we're going to move on now to the questions and answer section. I think we're just about on time for that.
Thanks, Steve. Thanks to everybody presenting. I'm going to pass over to my colleague David now, who's been working on some of the questions in the background. While David addresses those, we're going to drop our survey to the webinar in the chat. It'd be good while you're listening to the questions, if you don't mind, please, just to give us a little bit of heads up how you found today and what you sort of need for the future with regards to support. That would really help us out. Okay, David, I'll hand over to you. Have we had any questions coming in so far?
Thank you very much, Rob, and to all the presenters. I hope you found it really helpful. Some really interesting questions, and what's been what I've monitored throughout the presentation is very often I'm typing away trying to answer something, and you get to a slide and the presenters have actually started discussing that actual topic. So we started with a lot of questions, but they have started to dry up as we go through. I presume that's because the presenters with the content that they've delivered have answered those questions for you. So we do have 10 minutes to go through, or even longer if needed, but to certainly 10 minutes or so where the whole panel can answer your questions. So please do type away. If there's anything that the presenters have discussed and you're not quite too sure on, you think you might get it, maybe not, or you'd like them to cover it again, we can go back over slides, we can go backwards with the slideshow, cover something again, maybe pick up those topics. So please do start typing away any further questions. There's the questions so far, which have probably been covered, are around the knowledge test. So some feedback that there's been low success rates on the knowledge test. So as mentioned by Steve, I think it was, that we've done a review of that. That happens anyway. So as part of our own quality assurance, we'll review exams as they go live, particularly on the EPA. And as part of the continual monitoring that we do, there has been a review and there's been some recommended updates and changes. So as we get more data on that, we'll have more information to base judgments on. So it is something we have flagged and we will continue to monitor. Okay, so a couple of new questions come in. can we use another centre for EPA is one of those. So as a location, yes, you can. You would need to notify us of that location when you're booking. So if you sourced a new location, you made those arrangements yourselves direct with an alternate centre, all you need to do is give us a location of that when you're making your booking. Make sure the IEPers and LEPers are aware of which centre to turn up at and which learners will be there. They can carry out that activity at an alternate centre. But again, you might want to ensure that they have all the facilities and maybe share some photographs beforehand if they've not previously had any EPAs there. So it is possible. CPA is now. Sorry, go.
Sorry, just to add to that, you put that within your EPA Pro gateway questions. There's actually a specific question that asks you if you're using a different centre, what is the address of that centre, and then they do need to complete the COVID declaration on our website as well. And for any face-to-face, we're still asking centres to complete our declaration. Sorry to interrupt.
Thank you very much. That's really helpful advice. Thank you. CPA is now part of CCM1. How do you get the minimum 4 if CPA1 is no longer carried out? We've got a couple of, well, we've got one answer there, but also, even though CPA as an assessment is built into CCM1, it's also a separate category. So I still think on the card it will show as CPA1, even though the assessment is merged. So it's still classed as an extra category. But I think even so, there's the unvented, which is a category as well, which was the response there. Should an apprentice fail the EPA, what impact does this have on the gas safe registration? Well, if the EPA is whole job competence and incorporates lots of many things, so they may be just falling short on a couple of those aspects. It may not stop the safety critical aspects of gas safe. If there was something absolutely dramatic that went wrong during that assessment, as it would on site, gas safe themselves could remove the registration for that candidate and that learner. So that is still a possibility. But just because they're not successful with the EPA, that isn't automatic. It would have to be something quite dangerous and possibly notifiable. The whole job competence, there are various ways a learner may be just short on parts of that whole job competence, whether it be the knowledge or various aspects. So that certainly isn't sort of automatic. Will there be a video of the webinar? Yeah, well, when we set up these webinars, we actually have the option of sharing that automatically. So we click a button when we set it up. Within a few hours, normally, they have to process the video that the software does. And what it will do is it'll send you a follow-up email from GoToWebinar with a link direct to this video. If people register for this webinar and can't make it live, they'll still get a link the day after with an email with a link to this video. So if you've got colleagues who you're not sure if they can make it live or not, I'd always recommend they register anyway. They'll still get the follow-up email with a link to the video. If you make it live, you can ask live questions, and you'll also get a follow-up email with a link to the video and a link to a attendance certificate, which can help towards your CPD. So there's a few extra benefits there for attending live. How is the work log reviewed, and is the on-site is this the on-site work logbook? Yeah, we're going to cover a lot of that in the second webinar, but yes, pretty much. There were some earlier questions on using e-portfolios, and if you're covering the content that's required, there's various forms of EPA e-portfolios. Sorry, they're possible. It's just a case that you've got to meet the rules. You've got to meet the rules of assessments, the rules of combination. It has to be accessible by your own IQA and therefore the EQA for the on program. So just the same as any other e-portfolio, really. What I'll do on that is I'll also reply with another link to the second webinar.
I've just dropped that in the chat, David. So for those who, we've had a few people say they was a bit late joining today. There's part 2 of this webinar, which is on October the 6th. We've just dropped a link in the chat, so anybody can use that link now live to register on that while we're actually still on the webinar. To save you getting the link off the presentation and in the handouts, you can download the presentation from the handout section of GoToWebinar. And you will be getting a recording, as David said. But while we're on today now, you can actually use that link I've just dropped in the chat, and you should be able to register.
Thank you, Rob. Thank you. Someone saying they didn't get the live link for the last 989 webinar. Sorry about that. That should have happened. We have put that detail in. I'd check possibly your junk email. We've had quite a few people say, because it comes direct from GoTo, not from us. Sometimes it's identified as junk, possibly. So it might be worth checking that. You're saying you have checked. Then we'll have to investigate that. Then that should happen automatically from the software. So we'll have to check that. What are the charges? Yeah, the fees and the charges on the wall garden. There's also an EPA checklist if it's still up to date. I don't know if my colleagues can confirm that, but we do have an EPA price list on our website.
Yeah, from wall garden, as David says, we don't generally share these on webinars and things like that because of, obviously, we've got competitors, etc. So we all our customers can access the relevant prices. If you want anything like that, we're not sort of brushing you off. You've got our contact details from today's webinar. You can drop Janice, David, myself a line, and we can sort you out on anything like that.
Thanks, Rob. What we'll do, if you leave it 24 hours to get the link to the video and the follow-up, check spam and junk email folders. If you don't receive anything, if you drop myself or Rob an email, we'll investigate that. We can always get the link ourselves and send it, but also the registration link that you have, that works as well. So if you go on to registering yourself, people can register for the webinar a week after it was run, and it'll just show you the video. So it's another way of getting access to the video. But if anyone's having problems, let us know, and you should all be getting it. So if someone hasn't, then we need to find out why. If it's just one out of a group, we can imagine it was a problem with that one email. But if 100 people attend and no one gets it, then there's a problem with the software. But we'll check that out, no problem. No more questions. What we'll do then, we won't keep you on any longer than need to be. Time's moving on, but we will stay on and answer questions if you do have some. So just a last shout out, really, please. Any final questions, please type away. Anything you'd like us to cover again. We'll just give it a minute, and then if we don't have any further questions, we will close.
David, can I just point out something? You're talking about resources. We do have a lot of more detailed slideshows on Smart Screen for the EPA, for the gas engineering EPA. So if you are a subscriber to Smart Screen, you can go on Smart Screen, look on the EPA area, look under gas engineering, and you'll see that there's at least probably about 6 or 7 slideshows for the EPA, and they're a lot more detailed from the information we've given you today. So you'll get a lot more information out of it. So I just thought I'd point that one out. And something Steve said earlier on as well about the resources, and I mentioned it as well. If you have got your facility ready, could you please do a dry run on it between yourself and staff maybe? Because we have some, we've turned up and there's been loads of leaks, or the gas, we couldn't get the gas on, couldn't get the electric going, and so on. And some candidates had to sit there for a few hours waiting. So if you do have a facility, please make sure you do a little dry run on it before you actually put a candidate through it. All right, just be a good idea, I think.
Yeah, that's great advice. Thanks very much, Neil. Yeah, dry run's always good, I think, with an assessment before running your first EPA. You can do it with a member of staff, and it can also be quite enlightening for the tutor themselves to sort of do a walkthrough. It helps you when you're preparing
sorry, David, there was a couple of questions about the work log on there, which we're going to cover next week. But I just thought I'd say that someone did ask about the difference between electronic and hard copies. Probably the majority we get are hard copies in paper version, so they have to be scanned, uploaded. We'll talk about that next week in more detail. But some people are moving over to the electronic versions a bit more now. So
yeah, that's.
Sorry.
Does someone else have a point or? No? Okay. So yeah, that's great advice. Yeah, the logbook session next week would be really helpful, I think. So we really look forward to that. A couple of more points about the links. So we need to double check that we are definitely ticking the correct boxes and getting the links. If you need any information as part of the follow-up that you don't get automatically, please drop us an email and we can always follow that up with you separately and send you a copy. There is in the handout section, I know Rob mentioned it earlier, but on the right hand side, or where your panel is, if you've got it on your right hand side, if you click handouts, you should see a copy of the presentation and you can download your own copy directly from here. So, we're getting a bit of a mixed bag. So some people saying they've not got the link, some saying they've got the email but without the link. So that's all a little bit strange. We'll double check we're ticking the right boxes and hopefully that problem will sort itself out. But as a plan B, as I say, just get in touch with us and we'll fix that up for you separately. So there doesn't seem any further questions. If you can email any other questions before next week, if you can register for next week's webinar, if you do have any questions from this one that you want answering, or you may remember in a couple of hours' time, please email myself or Rob with those. We will do our best to answer them. If you've got anything you'd like us to cover next week in the logbook session, you could even send us an email. We can share it with Neil and Steve, and they can try and weave it into the presentation that they've pretty much completed now, but they can always weave in a few bits more if there's something else you're looking from them next week. So we'll try and accommodate all your needs. And the good place to put that on is on the survey, because that is shared with all the presenters and we can see where your worries, concerns, pinch points are. And if you found it useful, that's great to drop that in there as well, because it all helps us promote internally future webinars and sessions. If people find them valuable and getting information from them, it's much easier for us to put future sessions on as well. So please do share that. So I think we'll close then. There's no further questions. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you very much to all the presenters for that information, and it's been put across really well. I love the slides. Thank you very much, and we look forward to seeing you all next week. Have a nice evening, everyone. Goodbye.
Thanks all. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.
Thank you.